My name is Arthur Wolfe. I'm 31 years old and I am a resident of Sweden in Northern Europe. I have been a game journalist, first of all, game developer at times, and I have worked a lot with the general media reporting on video games in the past. I've also done a lot of part-time work organizing video game related charity events, and I am a rather prolific streamer.
So I guess a good place to start is, I know in the course of us starting to email, you got a job, which congratulations. But I also noticed that your Twitter bio describes yourself as a former journalist. Why? Basically, for people who don't know anything about journalism, why is it still important to broadcast that?
Well, once a journalist, always a journalist, technically speaking. I mean, it sticks with you for a while. Once you've gotten into the journalistic mindset, it never leaves you. But I am not active in the journalistic field professionally anymore, and basically just make use of what I learned during my time as a video game journalist for hobby projects, like the one we will be covering today.
Yeah, so I think, if I'm remembering correctly, you got a job outside of video games, is that right?
That is correct. I was offered a position at a large security company here in Sweden, because I had previously worked with digital security as well on the database end, and they figured that that combination of IT tech know-how and my previous work in physical security as well made me a pretty good position. So
I think for people who describe themselves as video game journalists, or people who are journalists who cover video games, usually sort of the only two ways, quote unquote, up and out is either at a publication or working in PR for a video game company. Do you think that says something sort of about journalists in the space and who they're beholden to, or how the industry works, or do you think that says anything at all?
Well, I have to say that the publisher's grip on game journalism has steadily hardened over the years. Back in the early 90s, when I actually got into games media personally, you could tell that the journalists themselves didn't really technically think of themselves as journalists many times. They were essentially video game fans that realized that there was a market for writing about games and people wanted to read about it, so they had a lot of fun with it. But then the publishers started gating a lot of information. You got into the whole preview events thing and blacklist, and suddenly you realized that a lot of large publications really couldn't do much actual journalism for fear of, losing access to the media that they're actually trying to report on.
I mean, do you think that's changed?
I think that it has improved a little bit, somewhat thanks to the general globalization of the thing that we experience, thanks to high-speed internet, social media, and so on, that we have a lot of people who can now make small, low-key reports or write about things in the games industry that matter to them,
right,
rather than on a large scale as part of a publication. We see a lot of people who use YouTube for vlogging. They have various blogs and live journals. They use Twitter to bring up interesting topics inside the game industry that matters personally to them. And you can aggregate this information very effectively, if you care to actually get a lot of really good coverage on the video games industry at large without having to refer back to major publications.
Do you feel like, we're going to be talking a little bit about cultural respect. Do you feel like at maybe more mainstream publications that sort of journalism about video games doesn't get cultural respect?
I think that there is still a bit of essentially separation between video games media and other media, because it's still largely regarded as something slightly more childish. Video games are basically going through the exact same process, such as, recorded music and television and so on already has.
Yeah.
In fact, when the film industry started out, everyone was like, oh yeah, sure, like I'm going to give up theater for moving pictures. Sure, it's a technological marvel, but who cares? It doesn't even have sound, jeez. And then 8 years later, we're sitting here with our Blu-ray players and going, wow, this is fantastic. You're basically seeing the exact same pattern repeated that we've already seen multiple times in history, that whenever a new medium pops up, the old guard have to do the best they can to decry it, because they are essentially losing ground, and they don't really like that.
I mean, are there things you notice that just doesn't get covered in the media about video game industry or video game culture at all?
I think that there is always this general idea whenever you try to cover video game culture that it's a bit of, hey, take a look at this mysterious subspecies of human being. This guy plays video games for a living. How weird is that? It's like, well, I know this guy who works with a terrier dog and chases rats around in London. That's a pretty strange job too, isn't it?
Well, I think it's for the video games side. I think what you're talking about, it's the perception that it isn't even work, even if a large part of what the work is in those cases is sort of being a performer.
Very much so. You see a lot of people who are doing things with video games, whether it's actually making them, playing them for profit, playing them for charity, or just doing interesting things with them. And people still seem to think that it's basically just grown-ups who have become really good at playing with toys.
Well, so, I mean, you had mentioned, maybe this is a good chance to start elaborate on some of your non-video game journalism work, which is, I mean, you mentioned that you felt just being in the trenches in the past, that journalism about video games is reactive and not active. What is that difference, and why is that important?
Well, in news journalism, where I started out originally, generally speaking, you throw out a couple of feelers, you get a phone call from someone saying something's going down, if you're interested I can help you look into it. And then you go out and you start digging around, you ask questions, you interview people. You don't ask for permission even to interview people. You essentially ambush people and you say, hey, mind telling me a thing or two about your employer? And then a couple of weeks, months, sometimes even years later, you have a interesting piece that you can put out that boldly declares that, oh, you know, this and that was going on at that factory, this politician has been doing this and that, and people get to react to your journalism. In video games journalism, it's often the case that you get a PR email from a publisher that goes, okay, we have a big new game coming out, could you send one of our guys over here to do some coverage on our game? And the publication goes, yeah, sure, we'll send a guy out. And then he goes to a hotel, he stays overnight, he gets to watch some people play the game, he writes a piece and goes, oh yes, this looks very interesting, I'm looking forward to more information, and then he goes home. He doesn't ask any really technical questions, he doesn't start asking difficult questions, because that's not really what you do when you've been invited to someone else's party. And that is, I think, the major factor that separates a lot of the good old-fashioned journalism, if I may be so horribly cliche, and the modern media journalism in general, that we don't dig around much, because we still feel that no one really wants to read about it. It's boring.
Well, what I've noticed is, well, maybe the question is this. I mean, do you notice, is there sort of a typical or a common way that the enthusiast media will sort of mishandle legit, actual, big, hard-hitting stories?
That is true in all enthusiast media, I think. Unless there is a major scandal, most people won't actually look into it. If we're talking the upcoming console releases, video games, what is going on at the given development studio, I mean, we get to the stories well after the fact sometimes, that there have been horrible working conditions at a certain developer studio, or someone has been finagling money out of one game project in order to fund another game project and just letting a game rot in development hell and stuff like that. But people aren't actively looking for it. We just essentially tend to find out once the game is released. And this is the same for pretty much any enthusiast sector, because you don't want the bad news. People don't want to read bad news about their hobby, because that's unpleasant. They don't want to hear that that movie they've been looking forward to, it's going to be terrible. They don't want to hear that that car of the brand that they enjoy is actually of shit build quality and is going to have delays in the production. And you don't want to hear that, oh, the PS4 is not going to have this, and oh, they're dropping the backwards compatibility here, and actually there are major problems with the sound chipsets on the Nintendo Switch or whatever rumors are coming up, because it's difficult to substantiate, because the enthusiast industries are generally speaking very closed off. You can't walk into a factory in China and go, hey, mind letting me take a look at that new Nintendo Switch prototype because I want to know if this rumor is true. You will never be able to do that.
Well, you said... Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, it's just that in traditional journalism, that sort of infiltration work, if I can put it like that, is a lot more common, is that you actually try and get in there. You travel over there, you talk with people on the ground, but you can't really do that with video games or generally media, because unless you're clearly invited to do so, you're never going to get that kind of access.
Well, what I've noticed is, it can feel like to me at times that I don't think it's far-fetched to sort of suggest, maybe there's a lot of stuff that falls through the cracks, if sort of the more mainstream outlets sort of look down on it, or they see it sort of as childish, as you say, and for the enthusiast media, there's a lot of stuff that just they don't look at, and there's just a lot of stuff in the middle that just is just disappearing or isn't even considered worth looking at. But you said also, that people who rise through the ranks in the enthusiast space I'll just quote you back to you if that's okay. You said they have a little integrity to speak of and like to use their positions to heavily imply that their opinions have more weight than that of lesser people. Who are the lesser people that, I'm not asking you to name names, but what is the dynamic you see play itself out over and over again?
Well, in most enthusiast media, this doesn't matter if we're talking about cars, model trains, or video games. People who reach a position where they are allowed to speak to the crowd, so to speak, often tend to gain some sort of, I won't say bloated ego, because that's a bit mean, really, but they do seem to gain the idea that they are where they are because they are so much better at analysis and understanding what is going on than other people. You see a lot of journalists on social media, specifically Twitter, in my case, that basically inform people that no, this is this way, and it's this way, and it's this way, and if you disagree with me, clearly you are wrong because you don't know what's actually going on. One of my favorite examples is when EA Maxis released the new SimCity back in 2013, I believe.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah, where that was one of the worst launches of a city simulating game I can remember, honestly. It was absolutely dreadful. The servers weren't working, the game was horrifically bugged, the game mechanics seemed to be complete nonsense, and so on. And certain journalists, I will not name names here, but suffice to say that a considerable number of journalists immediately jumped out to defend the game. They say that, oh no, you can't complain about this, you can't complain about that, it's just minor issues, don't be silly. And people were saying, it says that it has to be always online, that doesn't seem sensible. Why would a city simulator need to be always online? And I remember one particular editor at a publication boldly stated that you can't claim to know anything. If EA says that it needs to be always online, that's that. And less than 48 hours later, enthusiast users had actually made a patch for the game that removed the always online component, because it turned out that not a single function in the game except for the actual minor multiplayer function required any sort of online connectivity. And this particular editor, he never brought that back up after he had been proven wrong, catastrophically wrong, because you never admit that you're wrong when you're in that position, because that doesn't jive well with who you are and what you're doing. You believe yourself to be an authority in the area of video games, but a lot of people seem to have difficulty understanding that video games is an enormous area of media. You have no clue what's going on outside the perhaps 3 or 4% of the video game industry that you are into. a lot of people seem to say video games as if this just one huge nebulous concept, which once you grasp it in your hand, you are the king nerd. But I think those of us who have been around and played games since the 80s, we realize that doesn't work. Because it's basically it's an entire world.
Right. Well, it's an entire galaxy, and it's sort of. I mean, it's interesting because I think that's sort of a lot of what we're going to wind up talking about momentarily is sort of the ways that these different worlds can eclipse each other and almost make them certain ones seem invisible or apart or separate or invisible. I don't really know the best, smoothest way to segue into this other than maybe it makes sense to ask you to talk a little bit about the documentary that you've been working on. Otherwise, I'm just going to start asking you questions about pornography. That's going to be a bit abrupt and out of nowhere. But for people who are reading and don't know about this project, can you just sort of talk a little bit about what that project is and what got you interested in it?
What my project is? It originally began as me just sitting at home one evening and thinking, there is precious little information about pornographic games. I mean, sure, that might seem like a messed up thought to suddenly pop up in your head, but when you worked as long as I have and played as many games as I have, you started running out of material. But
okay.
But it essentially just brought me pause, and I realized that I never read any books or seen any documentaries or YouTube shows about that absolutely gigantic industry. Because let us not fool ourselves here. The pornographic side of the video games industry, it is enormous. More about that later. So I started searching around, and I honestly couldn't find anything. The closest you could get were some of those slightly sleazy old blogs that you could find on GeoCities, where there's this guy who makes a lot of frequent visits to Japan and brings back pornographic games, and he reviews them, and it's like, yes, the girls were very attractive. I like them a lot. It's like, yeah, you're not telling me much about the, cultural differences or the media impact or anything. All you're saying is that you really like that lady's memories. Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
A lot of glowing reviews, I'm guessing.
Oh yeah, 5 out of 5 erect penises all the way. But I started looking into it because I figured that maybe someone should actually make something, and that basically led into me starting doing a lot of research, reaching out to many esteemed experts in the field of Japanese games in particular, because that is where the pornographic side of the video games industry is strongest and has been for decades.
Right.
And I realized that there is just so much material to work with that I decided, you know what, I'm going to make a documentary about this, purely because it intrigues me that there is so much here that no one knows about. If you asked any random video game enthusiast, do you know about the term eroge? And they're like, that sounds vaguely Japanese. And it's like, oh yeah, let me tell you all about it. And 20 seconds later, they will be running away from you. I mean, let's not fool ourselves here. The area of pornographic or erotic games, if you prefer, it's not really a clean subject that you can bring up at a dinner table.
Mm-hmm.
It is much like ordinary pornography in that it's the sort of thing that pretty much everyone has enjoyed at one point in their lives, but no one will ever admit it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, people who star in pornographic films don't admit to watching porn.
I mean, it's interesting because, as I'm sure you can imagine, I'm sure this won't be a surprise to you. So I've done, in the last 3 years, this is my 215th interview. I'll send you some balloons after. But just over the course of it, just video games and pornography have wound up being mentioned in the same breath a lot. And last week I was sort of reminded in another interview that there was a point in time where maybe in the 70s, where pornography wanted to prove that it is art, and this is sort of a thing that video games has sort of shouldered, wanting to prove that it's art. And I mean, maybe you can talk a little bit about this. Like, why do you think people want things to be art when even the art world can't agree on what's art?
I think it is a form of legitimizing your hobby, really. I mean, I don't think it's much more difficult than that. And once again, on many different forms of media have gone through the exact same problem.
Right.
When we got radio and we got radio plays, they essentially tried to replicate theater over the radio waves because they thought that, hey, this will legitimize the radio as an actual expression of art. That's why radio plays were as popular as they were back in the 20s and 30s. And then television arrived, and they had the exact same problem, that everyone was just saying, oh, you're watching TV, they'll just melt your brain. And the film industry tried to compensate for that by actually creating things that were worthy of note. And we arrived at video games, and now we're like at the bottom rung of the ladder here, because video games are a development of electronic toys. I mean, everyone went into this thinking, oh, hey, look, this will be great fun for the kids. And then the people who grew up with video games became adults, and they realized, holy shit, I'm still playing with electronic toys. I must look like a childish little idiot.
Right.
And the first human reaction, whenever you enjoy something, you want to legitimize it in the social arena. It doesn't matter what it is. I mean, I like to say that a nerd can enjoy anything. There are football nerds, there are video game nerds, there are car nerds. The main difference between these different nerd groups is what has been socially legitimized and what has been described as either masculine or feminine or, gender neutral, just cool.
Yeah.
Because caring incredibly much about which football team advances to the playoffs, that is nerdery, straight up. I mean, sure, you enjoy football, I imagine, but it doesn't really matter to the world who wins the Super Bowl. Yet millions of people think this is one of the year's most important events, and they will put their lives on pause to be able to be in front of that computer screen or TV screen. And with video games, it's the same thing. You have, let's take World of Warcraft for an example. You have adult people in the Western world who have spent 25,000 hours of their lives playing World of Warcraft. If you put that into comparison to other hobbies, you realize that, all right, if you've been playing soccer or tennis for your entire life, sure, you probably have 25,000 hours of, sports below your belt. But playing World of Warcraft for 25,000 hours, that is the sort of thing, that's an alarming thing. That makes your parents want you to see a psychiatrist. Like, why have you wasted 25,000 hours on playing Warcraft? And really, you haven't, because if you enjoyed the time spent, then it wasn't honestly wasted, because you have been enjoying yourself. It's like saying, you've wasted 25,000 hours of watching film.
And I mean, it's true, how cyclical these things are, because that same criticism was levied against books. People said that books were a waste of time because they distract you from the real world and imaginary, people and problems and things. And I had interviewed a radio play historian for this project, and he told me that radio dramas were accused of being too violent, just like video games. But in your note to me, it's interesting because you connected pornographic video games with sort of the tradition of Roman brothel murals, which I think to the average person that would make them scoff. But can you explain sort of how this continues on in traditions that are that old?
Yeah, if we jump back in history and basically look at pornography or sexual depictions as just as a thing across history, you realize that pornography is almost as old as artistic expression in human history. We have clear archaeological evidence of pornography already back in antiquity, and we know in ancient Greece, and then during the Roman Empire, and then we move into the Indus Valley and we find things like the Kama Sutra, and then we move to the Eastern Asian area and we find all kinds of pornographic art. Mm-hmm. This is not something that we made up when we invented video cameras, like, oh, hey, time to film some people having sex. That will sell great. No, has been a big thing for literally millennia. And it has shifted back and forth how acceptable it is. During antiquity and during the medieval ages as well, I mean, all the way up to the Puritan reforms of the 19th century, we really viewed sex and a lot of other bodily functions, such as defecating and so on, as a lot less embarrassing than they are today. Because back then, in a very strongly patriarchal society where you had single men who were literally not allowed to masturbate because it was against religious law, you had brothels, because as long as you were paying a woman for her services, it was sort of kind of okay, not quite according to the Bible, but hey, the priests were doing it as well, so what can they say? And that sort of, I mean, pornography sort of fell under that umbrella, that while you were in the brothel, you looked at some pornographic depictions, you got yourself, hot and steamy and readied yourself up for when your favorite girl or guy, depending on your preferences, would be able to see you. And that sort of continued for nearly 3,000 years. And then suddenly we hit the Victorian age, where we decided, you know what, no, sex is bad, sex is terrible.
Yeah.
The idea of sex for any other reason than procreation in the Western world just became this disgusting concept that we were not allowed to discuss. And pornography sort of descended into the depths of the dark recesses of human society for a while there, and it stayed there all the way up until the 1970s. Pornography was still being produced en masse. In fact, one of the earliest films recorded on a video camera of any kind on film that we still have intact is a pornographic film. And the script is honestly a lot better than in most modern pornographic films, but that's a different matter entirely. We have to understand, essentially, that, as I like to put it, pornography is essentially an excellent mirror of the society it was created in. Because it is that playful, just poking at taboo, no matter where you are. You have the old depictions of sexual activities and proclivities in medieval art, on the pages of books, penned by priests and drawn by priests as well, monks working in monasteries, and they will be drawing women lifting up their skirts, and you can just imagine this 20-something saying, oh, look at this, ankles, oh. And in the East you have these, for example, the Kama Sutra, which is essentially part pornography and part a guide to how a husband and wife are supposed to engage in the bedroom. And you see that depending on what culture you're from, the depictions vary a lot, but the general message is always the same, that humans are sexual creatures and we shouldn't forget it. And the Western world is essentially the only major culture that decided all of a sudden that no, we're going to repress this into dust.
Yeah.
We did for roughly 100 years. And then the moment that we got into the media age, it immediately just re-blossomed, because once we got into the more liberal thoughts of the 1960s, the pornographic industry exploded, because suddenly it was okay again. We realized that, okay, having sex, probably not a sin.
Well, so I think, it's hard to generalize, but maybe sort of the most neutral way to ask is, for people who don't play these games, maybe for people who object to the existence of them, I mean, what sort of impact do these types of games have on people who will never play them? Like, what sort of butterfly effects are there that because of them?
Honestly, I think that the biggest effect that the erotic game industry will have on someone who doesn't play them is that the tax money made of selling them on the open market will go back into road work, more or less. Because the consumers of erotic games, generally speaking, as you mentioned, generalizations here, they cause about as much harm as grass I mean, they don't really do much. Because whether or not someone plays erotic games, you would never be able to tell from just looking at them, unless they were wearing a T-shirt that says "I like porn games" or something. I mean, even then you would think that they were being, post-ironic in this wonderful media society that we live in. But generally speaking, I don't think that there is a butterfly effect per se.
I mean, do you think? I mean, I don't know. I mean, do you feel like are the existence of these games, is it still controversial?
I think that it is controversial because it is a sort of foreign way of delivering pornography. And one of the major disadvantages of it being produced by this niche industry is that they tend to go all out. Because the same positive aspect of video games, that it is a complete fantasy world that you create, and you don't have to worry about hurting actual people, you don't need to worry about things making sense and so on, because it is a completely fabricated interactive medium. That sort of backfires a bit when it comes to erotic games, because you get a lot of people who are actually quite sexually twisted, who suddenly have the ability to create exactly what they enjoy.
Yeah.
So you get games ranging from the completely harmless, romantic visual novels and the like, sort of stuff that you see sold on the open market, and slightly toned down versions even pop up on Steam.
Right, yeah.
And on the other end of the spectrum, you have things like Maiden Rape Assault 2, Violent Semen Inferno. And you realize that if a person who is unfamiliar with the idea of erotic games is produced with the latter title, if that is presented to them, they are going to lock themselves in the bathroom and call the police.
I mean, I always assumed that some of the controversy or perceived controversy around these is from baggage from the 70s and 80s of people thinking video games are just for children. Is that part of it, you think?
I honestly think that erotic games thankfully sort of sidestepped that, because interestingly enough, when they emerged as their own genre in the early 80s, they had the advantage of being adult media made by adults for adults. You couldn't buy them in the stores without, looking under the counter or purchasing them by mail order. There was no real exposure. The children didn't get exposed to it through media, and so people sort of thought that, this is working fine. It's okay. It's no big problem. But in Japan especially, the industry was allowed to essentially just grow as much as it wanted. It was still very much a cottage industry. It was enthusiasts, as we've been going back to here, over that were making these games and selling them to other enthusiasts. And while the material was often sort of disturbing, in the early era, especially in the mid-80s in Japan, we had a lot of what we would call, pedophilic material in the West. And that is something that you can discuss for hours, but we're not going to get into it now. But the Japanese government did not see it as a major issue, because once again it was not being broadcast in the open media, and only the people who were interested in it partook of it, and as such they were just letting it be. Better not to stir the pot, because then we're actually going to see a boil over. And then some people went too far. The spark that lit the fire that led to the explosion, you could say, that I think created the largest counteraction towards erotic games is a little game called 177, which is the Japanese penal code for sexual assault. And it is literally a sexual assault simulator released on the open market for home PCs in Japan, and that got so much media exposure, both due to the subject content and the name, that tens of thousands of people suddenly opened their eyes and went, oh shit, there are horrific perverts hiding in basements, planning horrible deeds and using these games to train. It is essentially the same reaction that the Western media got to games like Call of Duty during the late 90s, early 2000s, where we unfortunately had a long string of terrible tragedies and school shootings and the early onset of global terror, and people immediately started looking to video games and saying, oh, is this what's causing our children to become violent? It was the exact same effect, only that they started blaming sexual crimes and various perverse industries and their growth not on their own society, but the media that small subsections of that society consumed. Because it is always easier to demonize a section of media than to admit that, okay, maybe we as a culture, as a society, is doing something wrong.
Well, I feel that Western media is sort of quick to say games just featuring sex in any way are somehow misogynistic, that there's this sort of attitude of just, if you remove them, that people thinking about it will, the thoughts will disappear, shut themselves down. I mean, do you find that that's sort of a common reaction, or?
Well, on your side of the pond, as we Europeans like to express it, certainly. I mean, it is a very American thing that sex in media is largely regarded as far more harmful than violence in media. We in Europe have sort of taken the other stance that, a bare nipple or two, I mean, who cares? I mean, one of the first things you saw after your birth was most likely your mother's nipple when you came in for your first meal.
I mean, I'm sure you remember, reactions to, say, Dragon's Crown, which isn't even... I wouldn't even put that in the same category as any of the games you've mentioned, would you?
No. Definitely not. But, that is an excellent example of where you have the sexualized designs on both sides of the fence, honestly. I mean, all the designs in that game are essentially the over-idealized fantasy form, as you would see on the cover of a fantasy book from the 70s or 80s. But it arrived at an inopportune time, and it was a little bit too much for a lot of people's sensibilities, and thus you got that immediate counteraction that, oh no, this game... it is just misogynistic and nonsense. It is masturbatory material for 12-year-olds who have somehow stayed 12 until they were 25. And while I personally disagree, I mean, the idealized form in media is basically ever present, and you will find it anywhere if you just look for it. I see a lot of that reaction to all games that have some form of sexual content, especially in America, where you have a slightly shorter fuse generally than Europeans do when it comes to these things. Mm-hmm. We tend to react a lot faster to violence, while Americans tend to react a lot faster to sexual content, and then we just all agree in the middle that Nazis are terrible and need to die.
Well, I mean, I feel like I would probably need to ask an anthropologist this, but I mean, you mentioned some about religion earlier. I mean, how do you feel sort of the West's history of Judeo-Christian teachings versus the East's Shintoism and Buddhism has impacted each hemisphere's perception of sex in our media?
Well, unsurprisingly, the Judeo-Christian faiths of the West, which generally regard sex as something that happens after marital union between man and woman, and it's for procreation, you're supposed to increase the number of followers of God by breeding, and so on. Meanwhile, in the East, they're a lot more liberal with that thing, because religion did not meddle much in that. They still felt that, all right, marriage is between a man and a woman, but if you want a couple of mistresses, sure. I mean, it's good for you to have kids. So if there are 3 women around and only one man, screw it, marry all of them. It doesn't really matter that much. And if you have that sort of social, just cultural baggage that, on one side we have people who say if you want to get divorced, you will have to ask the Pope. And on the other hand, it's, you want to get divorced, well, just kill her, I guess.
Right.
Then you get a very different cultural base from which to build your future society. So I think that especially in the West we have a very strong, especially in America, you have a very strong Puritan heritage, because those were the values that your nation was formed upon. And we also in Europe, I mean, we have been Christians for nearly 2,000 years at this point, and have ingrained a lot of these general ideas. And it's very difficult to put those aside and say, no, I disagree, I think it should be like this. That is the sort of development that we have only seen in the 20th century, 21st century. Up until, say, 1915, basically the World War I, Europe was still very strongly a Christian stronghold. A lot of people identified as Christian. They had Christian values. We still had a large number of Catholics. But now, roughly 100 years later, you have found ourselves in a far more secular society where this sort of content is no longer frowned upon quite as heavily as it was. The Eastern nations, for example, they did not have to go through that. They did not have to defeat the religious opposition to this sort of content because it was never regarded as religiously wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I touched on that a bit in my documentary, but not terribly much yet, because I feel that this is the sort of thing where if you don't want to generalize, you need a lot more local data and you need to speak with an expert. But this is what I feel from what the research that I have done. This is basically my findings.
Well, similarly, I mean, maybe it's unsurprising to frame it this way, but from what I've heard, most kink communities are more open-minded and more tolerant than, your typical video game community, if such a thing exists. So, I mean, there are subsets where, these communities can be globalized as well, as you mentioned. Why do you think there is still such a almost sort of self-repressive or puritanical, attitude within video games if at the same time, there's this big push to sort of declare it's an art form?
Well, it is that strange duality of, I think, is perceived persecution, because a lot of people who work in the video games industry, especially in the media industry, they want video games to be taken seriously as an art form so that their work is legitimized, but that also has the problem that comes with it. If you want it to be legitimized as an art form, then you need to put it under scrutiny. And that makes things really difficult, because while people care quite a bit about video games, they generally speaking do not care enough about it to accept it being put under scrutiny and criticism. If video games had the same sort of lobbies and, political campaigning and just large-scale analyses and scrutiny as such film industry in Hollywood, I think that a lot of the video game industry would immediately wish that it hadn't been legitimized as an art form, because it makes life a lot more difficult. Because once you're legitimized, you have to start motivating things. You have to say, oh, I play this instead of this because of that, and I do this and I do that, and you like this, and then suddenly someone comes up and says, oh, but haven't you heard about X and Y and Z issues about this game? How can you support this game? And suddenly you're saying, man, it's just a video game. Cool it.
Yes.
I think that a former editor at Game Informer tweeted once that he was very glad that he didn't care about video games. And I think that essentially, that exemplifies basically how this strange duality is at work here, because he only had that job because enough people care about video games that there is money in writing about video games. There is money in reporting about video games. He does so professionally, but he's terrified of the idea of one day waking up and actually caring about video games as a thing. People want to be able to drop it and leave it behind the moment it becomes, shall we say, socially unacceptable, or it sort of starts hindering your advancements, whether it is in a romantic relationship, in the workplace, or just, through social contact. You don't want to be that one guy in the room when everyone else is talking about, oh, I like to hang out, I like to go hiking, I like canoeing, I race motorbikes, and then someone pipes up and says, I really like the Nintendo Wii U. And then you're that guy all of a sudden. And I think the people don't want that. They want to care about video games, they want to discuss video games, they want to argue about video games. Oh, people love arguing about video games.
I was going to say, yes, they do.
But they want to have just enough care that they can get truly involved, but just little enough care that when it push comes to shove, they can say, "Oh no, I mean it's just video games."
Is that something that I don't know how recent? I mean, I know when you started your new job, but I don't know until how recently you were doing writing about games. Is that something that you enjoyed about the job or the work? Is sort of, I mean, it does seem like there's almost this expectation that the writing that you do is sort of beside the point, and the real point is to sort of just incense people on social media.
Well,
the work is almost a distraction. I mean, have you engaged in such things? Do you enjoy doing those things? Did you ignore doing those things?
No, I mean, when I went to journalism school, I mean, that alone makes me sort of unique, because most people who write about video games have nothing even resembling a journalism degree. But when I went to journalism school, I was often described as a conservative, because I was primarily concerned with the idea of actual reporting. I wanted the truth to be known, I wanted people to start thinking, and so on. And so when I worked as a video game journalist, I did a lot of, calling up developers. I visited their studios, I discussed I mean, a little bit like you're doing now, essentially, investigating the industry at large, how the people in it feel that they're being treated, how the industry is developed. And, I mean, sure, you have a new video game coming out, but until you can prove to me that it's good, I'm not going to hype it. That's your job.
Were you full-time at an outlet, or were you freelance?
I was freelance full-time, more or less. Technically, I was technically under a freelance contract, but I had to push out at least one major game review every week, more or less. So,
I mean, it sounds like you and I come from a similar spot of just sort of like you said. I mean, I think there was more to it than you sort of humbly said, that this sort of occurred to you as an interesting angle because you were bored. Did you feel like in your time as a journalist, like were there stories you really wanted to write but you couldn't get traction with editors or buy-in from the powers that be to give you the green light and do it for money?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to go into a proper journalistic project, either you need a lot of free time or you need a lot of free cash. I mean, let's not even pretend that that's not the truth, because if you are planning on, in my case,
I don't pretend that. I'm very aware. Yeah,
I mean, I live in Sweden. You can imagine how difficult it would be for me to fly out to San Francisco and visit an American video games developer where I've heard rumors about, misconduct in the workplace, that people are being bullied and they're forcing this game out, and I need to go in, get a few interviews, maybe snap a few shots of the building and talk to people. That doesn't happen. That doesn't happen. Yeah, it is practically impossible, because it would cost thousands and thousands of dollars to just get me there and back. And in all honesty, at the time I was working, which is still just only like 2.5 years ago at this point, there wasn't really not that much of a market for it. And I think that is really a sign that video games journalism and the video games media as such is not matured yet, because its target demographic has not matured yet to that point.
Right.
You have a lot of people who they will take it bite-sized. I think that is why social media is as popular as it is among video game journalists, because if you give it to people bite-sized, then, as you say, you can incense. You can start a discussion. You can open a forum. You can say, "Oh, hey, what about this thing?"
I don't even know if it's incensing a discussion. I mean, it sort of seems like often it's incensing, bludgeoning with an opinion. Like there's sort of like no quest for like what is the deeper truth here. It's just sort of you're wrong.
Yeah, well, then comes back to that whole "I am an authority because my title is a video game journalist." And then I immediately tweet back, "You didn't even play the first 3 games in the series, you pleb."
Yeah.
And then they get
but I mean, did you run into that though? Like other than this documentary you're working on now, I mean, were there stories in your time as a journalist you wanted to tell but just couldn't for whatever reason?
Well, there were a lot of similar ideas that I toyed with, and I took them up with my editor-in-chief. But I basically got the message that people go to, especially video game websites, they go there for 2 reasons. They want previews and they want reviews. Yeah. They want to know what's coming out and if it's going to be any cool. and they want to check the review score to confirm their opinion. That is why a lot of publications that have tried to get away from, the big number scores, they realize it's impossible.
Mm-hmm.
You can't write a paragraph that summarizes the general quality of the product and gives a recommendation based on your taste, because that's completely irrelevant. If you are a fan of, let us say, Final Fantasy
Sure.
29 comes out, the only reason you check that review is because you want to see what the score is. If the score is low, then you can say, oh, this guy's an idiot because I know it's better than that. If the score is high, you go, ha, told you so, the game is going to be amazing. And you basically use reviews mainly as things to lean on. You use them as an argument. The authority has spoken, the game is good, or the authority has spoken, the game is shit. And the person who wrote that article, he's no more an authority than you or I am. I mean, in many cases, I think that the enthusiasts are more of an authority than the people who are actually writing, especially when they're writing for publications that do not specialize in video games, because then you have the guy that does video games as well as, review the new iPhone and so on. But we need someone to write about Call of Duty 6 because it's going to be huge. We need the readership.